The gilded doors of Ashbourne Hall had stood for 300 years, and in all that time, they had never once opened for a woman who was secretly counting the curtsies of the 20 women ahead of her. Elara Voss stood at the end of the presentation line and counted anyway. Around her, silk gowns rustled with the barely contained anticipation of women who had been preparing for this moment since the schoolroom. Ostrich feathers trembled above powdered cheeks. Fans moved in slow, practiced arcs, stirring the air into something that smelled of hothouse lilies and expensive perfume, and, beneath it all, the particular anxiety of people who cared desperately what happened next. The corridor of Ashbourne Hall stretched ahead in a blaze of candlelight, each sconce placed precisely to illuminate the ancestral portraits lining the walls, every painted face severe as judgment. Elara did not have an expression like that. She suspected she looked exactly as she felt, which was as though someone had placed her, without warning, on the deck of a ship in a storm and expected her to dance. Her gown was borrowed. She had been trying not to think about that. It belonged to her cousin Philippa, a young woman of such comprehensive golden-haired perfection that even her cast-offs managed to announce their original owner's superiority. The dusty rose silk did not suit Elara's darker complexion. The feathers in her hair listed slightly to the left, the milliner's discount bin announcing itself in the most delicate way possible. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. And the court curtsy she was expected to execute in approximately 14 minutes, that deep, balletic surrender of knee and spine that acknowledged the authority of the man at the end of this corridor. She had practiced it exactly twice. Both times, she had fallen down. Not dramatically, not enough to constitute a true catastrophe. More in the manner of a woman who had underestimated the combined weight of borrowed silk and genuine terror, her knees sinking correctly, her back attempting correctness, and then the slow, treacherous sideways drift that no amount of determination could prevent. Her Aunt Helena had watched both attempts from a chair by the fireplace, her expression a specific blend of disappointment and resignation that had become her primary communication method since Elara arrived in London 6 weeks ago. "You must practice more," she had said, with the tone of someone stating that the sun must rise. "I understand the mechanics," Elara had replied, which was perfectly true. She had read 3 manuals on court presentation and memorized the relevant passages with the same thoroughness she had once applied to translating Cicero from the original Latin. The mechanics were clear. The execution was apparently a different matter entirely. Her father had not believed in court presentations. Professor Edmund Voss had believed in 4 things with the absolute conviction of a man who had never once been wrong about anything that mattered: Greek tragedy, Roman philosophy, English literature, and his daughter's mind. He had spent 23 years pouring knowledge into Elara with the focused joy of a gardener cultivating something rare and remarkable. Languages, mathematics, history, philosophy, she could discuss Aristotelian ethics at dinner and translate Sappho by candlelight and argue the finer points of constitutional law with men twice her age. She could not curtsy. It had never seemed important. In the village of Whitmore-on-Avon, where she had grown up surrounded by her father's books and the steady rhythm of the seasons, the most formal social requirement was remembering to use the correct fork at Reverend Aldgate's annual dinner. Court presentation had been an abstraction, something that happened to other girls. Girls whose fathers had planned for their futures rather than their educations. Her father had not planned. He had assumed, with the comfortable certainty of a man consumed by things more interesting than practicalities, that Elara would always be nearby, that their life of books and conversation and the occasional lively debate with visiting scholars would continue indefinitely, interrupted only by the tea she made and the letters she answered on his behalf, and the slow, manageable way time passed in the country. He had died in October, quietly, between one volume of Herodotus and the next, and left her everything which amounted to a library of 4,000 books. A house with a leaking roof she could not afford to repair, and the dawning realization that a comprehensive classical education was not, by itself, a practical plan for the future. Her Aunt Helena had arrived in November with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been expecting this call for years. Helena Westfield was her mother's sister, a woman of moderate fortune and considerable social ambition, whose own daughters, Philippa and the younger Cecily, had been successfully presented at court and were currently navigating the season with the focused intensity of generals planning campaigns. She had assessed the situation at Whitmore-on-Avon with 3 days of careful observation, determined that Elara was presentable if not spectacular, and made her pronouncement with the air of someone conferring a significant favor. "You'll come to London," she had said. "There is a chance you could make an acceptable match if you apply yourself. You're not without qualities." She paused, looking at Elara the way one might look at a promising ingredient for a dish one wasn't certain about. "Though we'll need to do considerable work on the social graces." Elara had understood this to be the most generous offer available to her and accepted accordingly. 6 weeks later, she stood in the corridor of Ashbourne Hall, her borrowed feathers listing left and her heart attempting escape, watching the 22nd woman ahead of her disappear through the gilded doors. She had not applied herself particularly well to the social graces. This was partly because they seemed to operate by rules so different from everything she had ever learned that they felt almost like a foreign language, one she had been handed without a grammar book, and partly because every moment she spent in her aunt's household reminded her so acutely of the life she had left behind that she could not quite bring herself to replace it wholesale with something new, and partly, she admitted to herself now, because she had been hoping the court presentation might be somehow cancelled. It was not cancelled. The 23rd woman disappeared through the doors. Elara was next. She had approximately 40 seconds to review what she knew. The great doors would open. She would walk forward with measured steps to the dais at the far end of Ashbourne Hall, where the Duke of Merrow presided over the formal presentations as Lord Chamberlain, a ceremonial role that had belonged to his family for 4 generations, and that he apparently performed with the same terrifying efficiency he brought to everything else. She would stop at the chalk mark on the floor, which she had been told was clearly visible if one looked down. She was absolutely not supposed to look down. She would hear her name announced. She would execute the court curtsy. She would be acknowledged. She would rise and withdraw. Simple. Mechanical. Perfectly within the capabilities of a woman who could translate ancient Greek. Then she heard the whispers. They had been building around her for the past 10 minutes, moving the way rumors always move through the subtle language of raised eyebrows and glances exchanged behind barely moving fans. She had caught enough fragments to piece together the picture. Not seen him smile in 2 years. They say he turned away Lady Arabella Fitch at last year's presentation. In front of everyone. Simply turned his back. His father died badly. Some business with a debt that was never fully explained. He's been colder since. Everyone says so. Lord Pemberton called him a man made entirely of ice and responsibility. Lady Dorothea expects an announcement at the midsummer ball. It's all but settled. Everyone knows. Heaven help whoever he doesn't approve of today. He lets it show. He always does, the Duke of Merrow. Elara had not thought much about him as an individual, focusing her limited preparation on the curtsy rather than the man receiving it. Now she assembled the fragments. Cold. Exacting. Unforgiving of social failures. A man who had, according to the woman 3 places ahead of her, once reduced a perfectly composed baronet's daughter to tears with nothing more than a look of such comprehensive disinterest that she had understood herself to be invisible to him, and, by extension, to everyone present. The great doors opened. Elara walked through them. Ashbourne Hall at full presentation was a different world from the corridor. The space was immense vaulted ceilings painted in the old style, deep blues and golds faded just enough to look like something from a dream rather than a decorating scheme. Crystal chandeliers blazed above 300 assembled guests arranged along the sides of the room, leaving the center clear. The chalk mark was visible from the doorway, a small white line on dark wood some 40 feet ahead, and beyond it the dais. She did not look at the dais. She looked at the chalk mark and walked. Her name was announced by the herald in the carrying tones of a man who had trained his voice to fill this room and had been doing so for 20 years. Miss Elara Voss, of Whitmore-on-Avon. The silence that followed was the particular silence of 300 people having the same thought simultaneously. Whitmore-on-Avon. The name meant nothing to them. She was nobody. A country girl with borrowed feathers and an absent fortune and no particular reason to be standing on this floor. She reached the chalk mark and stopped. She looked up. Caspian Vane, Duke of Merrow, sat on the dais with the particular stillness of a man who had long ago learned that stillness was its own form of power. He was not the portrait she had assembled from whispers. He was something more difficult and more present than that. Dark in coloring, spare in expression, with eyes the shade of deep winter sky that moved from the doors to her face in a single motion and stopped there with a focus so complete it felt almost like a physical weight. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year beyond it. He wore his authority the way some men wore their jackets, as though it had been cut specifically for him, and he had never considered putting it down. He was watching her the way a man watches something that requires careful assessment before any action is taken. She looked at him for exactly 1 second too long. She began the curtsy. The silk was heavier than she remembered. The knee descended with appropriate precision. The back began its necessary straightening. She had the correct angle, the correct weight distribution. The mechanics were exactly as described in the third manual she had read, and then her left heel, where the borrowed hem had caught beneath it, shifted. The shift was small. Its consequences were not. The correction she made threw her weight sideways. The correction for that correction threw it the other way. For one terrible, extended moment, she was suspended in a half-curtsy at the precise angle that was neither dignified completion nor acceptable recovery, her feathers trembling violently, 300 pairs of eyes fixed upon her with the collective held breath of people watching something they would describe for years afterward. Someone laughed. A single, quickly suppressed sound, but it filled the silence like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread. A murmur, a whisper, the rustle of 300 bodies shifting to observe better, to see more clearly, to be certain they had witnessed what they thought they were witnessing. The herald cleared his throat. It was over. She understood that in the same moment she understood she was not, in fact, falling. Her balance had steadied itself with an instinct her conscious mind had not managed, but that did not change what had been seen. A botched curtsy before the assembled company of Ashbourne Hall. Before the Duke of Merrow himself. Before everyone who would be anywhere this season, and several who would travel to others' houses specifically to repeat the story. She began to rise. The sound from the dais stopped her. Not her rising, she had not yet completed it. She simply stopped, because in 300 years, those gilded doors had never produced the sound that was currently moving across the great hall. The sound of a chair drawn back with careful deliberation. Of footsteps measured and unhurried and absolutely certain, descending from the dais and crossing the open floor. Toward her. The laughter died. The murmur died. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. She turned her head and watched the Duke of Merrow walk across his own hall in absolute silence. Every eye in the room tracking him with the focused disbelief of people witnessing something unprecedented. Something outside every parameter of understood behavior. Something that had no precedent in the 300 years of this room's history. He stopped before her. He took her hand. Not as a gesture of rescue. Not as condescension. He took it the way one takes the hand of someone whose company one is honored to keep, with a firmness and a care that had nothing of pity in it, and everything of intention. And then the Duke of Merrow, Lord Chamberlain, feared and cold and iron in all things, bowed. He bowed to her, a formal, deliberate, complete inclination of that proud dark head, as though she were the one in the position of honor, and he the one seeking acknowledgement. As though the rules of this room had simply rearranged themselves around her, and he was only observing the new order. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then it erupted, not in laughter this time, in something more complicated and more electric, a sound that ran through 300 guests like the first crack of lightning before a storm. Half scandal and half something that had no precise name. A collective restructuring of understanding, because the Duke never descended from the dais at presentations. Because the protocol was unambiguous and had never been deviated from in living memory. Because a man who had reportedly turned away Lady Arabella Fitch with a glance of comprehensive disinterest had just crossed his own hall and bowed formally, publicly, irrevocably to a girl with listing feathers from a village no one had heard of. He straightened. His eyes met hers. They were, she discovered up close, not precisely the cold winter sky of whispered report. There was something underneath the gray, not warmth, not yet, but something that was the possibility of warmth. Something that considered her carefully, without the sliding dismissal she had grown accustomed to from every quarter of the city. Something that saw her. "Miss Voss," he said, and his voice was low enough for her alone. "Welcome to Ashbourne Hall." He released her hand. He returned to the dais. He sat, and his expression settled back into the impenetrable composure that 300 guests would spend the next week attempting to interpret. And the presentation continued, and Elara somehow completed her withdrawal on legs that no longer seemed entirely her own. As she found her place at the edge of the assembled company, her heart still hammering against her ribs, she became aware of something she had not expected. The space around her where moments ago 300 guests had been crowding for better vantage to observe her humiliation was now a space of a different kind. Not empty, but weighted, reserved, watched in a way that had nothing of mockery left in it. She was being looked at, not through, not past, at, and across the hall, from the dais where he had returned to his duties with the efficiency of a man who had simply done an unremarkable thing and moved on. The Duke of Merrow's eyes moved once across the assembled company and found hers for the space of a single breath. Then he looked away. The reception that followed the presentations was called, in the language of Ashbourne Hall, an informal gathering. 300 people in their finest, with champagne served in crystal and music from a string quartet positioned in the gallery above, constituted Elara's new understanding of the word informal. She stood near the windows with a glass she was not drinking and attempted to become familiar with the sensation of being visible. It was deeply uncomfortable. Miss Voss. The voice behind her was smooth as silk over something harder beneath. What an extraordinary entrance you made. She turned. The woman who had approached was beautiful in the particular, polished way that suggested she had been aware of that fact since the age of 12 and had simply optimized accordingly. Dark golden hair arranged in a style that required no listing feathers. A gown of deep green silk chosen with the specific knowledge of how it would appear in candlelight. Eyes that assessed Elara with the swift, comprehensive efficiency of someone who never failed to identify where a threat might originate from. Lady Dorothea Crane, her companion a small, timid-looking woman at her elbow, supplied helpfully. Elara recognized the name from the whispers in the corridor. The woman who expected an announcement from the Duke at midsummer. She curtsied a much smaller, more manageable curtsy than the one she had recently attempted and said simply, "Miss Voss, it's a pleasure. I imagine everything here must be rather new to you." Lady Dorothea's smile did not change, but something in her eyes did. "Whitmore-on-Avon, was it? I don't believe I know it. Few people do. It's a quiet place." Clearly, a pause, precisely calculated. "You must have found today overwhelming." It had its moments. The Duke was remarkably kind. Lady Dorothea delivered this observation with the care of someone placing a sharpened instrument on a table between two people, though he is always considerate of guests who find themselves at a disadvantage. Elara was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room continued its elaborate social dance, conversations cresting and falling, glasses glittering, music from the gallery weaving through it all. She thought of her father's voice, patient and sure, reading aloud from Marcus Aurelius on winter evenings. The measure of character is not how a person behaves when observed. It is how they behave when it costs them something. "You're very generous in your interpretation," Elara said at last. "Though I wonder if generosity is quite the right word for what he did." Lady Dorothea blinked. "Just slightly. Just enough. I do hope we'll have the opportunity to know each other better this season," Elara added, and meant it in the most honest and uncomplicated way, which she understood Lady Dorothea would not believe, and could not therefore use against her. "If you'll excuse me." She moved away before she could be stopped, threading through the gathered company toward the windows at the far end of the room, where the garden beyond the glass was dark and cool and promisingly quiet. She needed air. She needed the particular silence she had always found in her father's library, where nothing was required of her except her own honest mind. What she found instead, standing slightly apart from a cluster of men near the farthest window, was the Duke. He was not looking at her. He was engaged in conversation with a silver-haired man of considerable authority, some discussion of genuine substance, from the focused attention both men gave it. He was, she noted, exactly as composed as he had appeared on the dais. No evidence in his bearing of the unprecedented thing he had done 20 minutes ago. No particular awareness of the room's ongoing reassessment of what he had created. He looked like a man who had done an entirely unremarkable thing and found the subsequent conversation unnecessary. As though he felt the observation, he turned his head. Their eyes met for the second time that evening. He inclined his head minimally, with the precise economy of gesture she was beginning to suspect was characteristic of him. Then he returned to his conversation. Elara turned to the dark window and pressed her fingertips to the cool glass and tried very hard to think clearly. About the evening. About what came next. About the fact that she was in London now, with an impossible season ahead of her and no particular plan beyond surviving it. She thought about these things for approximately 30 seconds. Then she thought about his face when he looked at her. The way the cold had not quite reached his eyes. The way his bow had been so deliberate, so certain, as though it required no explanation and brooked no question, as though he had simply seen something the rest of the room had not, and acted on it, and could not understand why everyone found this remarkable. She was going to need considerably more than fresh air. She was going to need, she suspected, an entirely new understanding of the rules of this world she had stepped into and of the man who had just, without warning, rewritten one of them entirely on her behalf. Tomorrow would bring her aunt's assessment and Lady Dorothea's observations spreading through drawing rooms across the city. Tomorrow would bring the question of what the Duke of Merrow had actually meant, and whether it meant anything at all, and whether a woman with listing feathers and a leaking cottage and 4,000 books she couldn't sell was foolish enough to let it mean something to her. But tonight, in the dark window glass of Ashbourne Hall, Elara Voss saw her own reflection looking back at her, and for the first time since her father's death, the woman in the glass did not look like someone merely enduring. She looked, Elara thought, a great deal like a woman who had just been seen for the very first time. She was not at all certain what to do with that, but she suspected with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent her life understanding things before she was ready for them, that she was about to find out. Morning arrived at the Westfield townhouse with the precision of a verdict being read aloud. Elara had barely finished dressing when her Aunt Helena appeared in the doorway of her room, not knocking, because knocking implied that what Elara thought about the interruption might matter, with an expression that cycled through several emotions in rapid succession before settling on something that looked, improbably, like satisfaction. "Sit down," her aunt said. Elara sat. 3 calling cards were delivered before breakfast. Helena set them on the dressing table with the careful deliberation of someone placing evidence before a jury. Lady Sutton, Mrs. Aldgate Pembry, and Lady Worthing, who has not acknowledged this household in 4 years, and who now extends an invitation to her Thursday salon. She looked at Elara steadily. "Do you understand what this means? That society has a short memory? That society has no memory at all when something more interesting replaces the last interesting thing." Her aunt sat on the edge of the chaise, folding her hands in her lap with the precise calm of someone managing several thoughts at once. What the Duke of Merrow did last evening will be discussed for weeks. The only question that matters now is how you conduct yourself in the space that discussion creates. Elara looked at the calling cards. Lady Sutton's was thick cream paper with a crest that probably traced itself to the conquest. Mrs. Aldgate Pembry's had a small ink blot in the corner suggesting some haste in writing. Lady Worthing's was immaculate and meant nothing good. "He bowed to me," she said carefully. "He was being kind to someone who had made a spectacle of themselves. I don't think it wise to build anything on that foundation." "I think," her aunt said, in the tone of someone who has decided not to argue because argument is inefficient, "that you are considerably cleverer than you allow yourself to appear, and considerably more frightened than you will admit. The two tend to produce the same result in young women in action dressed as wisdom." She rose. "We will call on Lady Sutton this afternoon. You will wear the blue muslin, and you will remember that opportunity, once it passes, does not generally return simply because you've decided you are ready for it." She left. Elara looked at the calling cards for a long moment, then at her own reflection in the dressing mirror, then back at the cards. She thought about her father's library. She thought about the weight of her father's key, which she still carried in the pocket of every dress she owned, which had opened a door to a room she would never enter again. She thought about the particular quality of the Duke's bow, not the drama of it, which everyone else seemed to be discussing, but something beneath that. The deliberateness, the absolute lack of apology, as though he had weighed every consequence of what he was doing and found them all irrelevant beside the thing itself. She put on the blue muslin. The weeks that followed the presentation were unlike anything Elara had experienced in 24 years of a life that had been, until recently, admirably uneventful. Invitations arrived. Not many. She was not, by any measure, a social triumph, but enough. Enough to fill her aunt's mornings with planning and her own evenings with the particular exhaustion of performing composure in rooms full of people who were watching to see what she would do next. The story of the bow had spread in the way that stories spread through London society, which was immediately, and in 17 slightly different versions, each one embroidered a little further from the truth. In some accounts, the Duke had actually spoken to her at length before the assembled company. In others, he had asked her name and committed it to memory visibly, which was apparently an event in itself. In the version circulating through the card rooms, there had been an exchange of meaningful glances that lasted the better part of a minute. Elara, who had been there, found the embellishments both impressive and deeply irritating. What was true was simpler and stranger than any of it. He had seen her begin to fail. He had crossed a floor. He had bowed. And something in that sequence of events had rearranged the social mathematics of her season in a way she had not asked for and was not certain she trusted. Lady Dorothea's version, which circulated through the drawing rooms on the second day and carried more weight than most by virtue of its source, was that the Duke had acted out of an impulse towards social charity, that he was, at heart, a man of great compassion who could not bear to witness genuine distress without responding to it. The interpretation was offered warmly, publicly, and with a smile that never quite reached the speaker's eyes. It was also, Elara understood, a precise and elegant operation. It transformed what the Duke had done into an act of pity rather than interest, and reduced her, in the same motion, from someone worth noticing to someone worth feeling sorry for. She had been in London long enough now to recognize the difference between a compliment and a blade dressed as one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was at Lady Sutton's musicale, 10 days after the presentation, during a pause between performances when the room rearranged itself in the slow social churn of people seeking better conversation, that someone sat down beside Elara on the small settee where she had been attempting to look engaged rather than overwhelmed. "You're doing that thing," said the voice beside her, "where you look very calm on the outside and are in fact cataloging every exit." Elara turned. The young woman who had settled beside her with the easy confidence of someone who sat wherever she liked was perhaps 19, with the Duke's dark coloring and eyes of a warmer gray, the shade of an autumn morning rather than a winter storm. She was dressed with the particular effortlessness of someone whose clothing had been chosen by excellent taste rather than anxious effort, and she was looking at Elara with an expression of frank, unapologetic curiosity that was startling in its sincerity. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Elara said. "No, because you've been avoiding anyone who might want something from you, which is admirable but limits the possibilities considerably." The young woman extended her hand. "Serafina Vane. Caspian is my brother. I've been wanting to speak with you since the presentation, but you move through rooms very quickly for someone who appears to be standing still." Elara looked at the outstretched hand, then took it. "Miss Voss, I know who you are. Everyone knows who you are now, which I understand is rather the problem." Serafina settled more comfortably onto the settee, unconcerned with her posture in the way that only the very secure ever are. "For what it's worth, I thought what he did was the bravest thing I've seen him do in 2 years. Most people seem to think it was kindness. Most people are interpreting it through Lady Dorothea's version, which she distributed very efficiently on day 2. Serafina's tone was pleasant and precise. "My brother doesn't do things out of kindness. He does things out of conviction. There's a difference that matters enormously and that very few people bother to make." She tilted her head. "He hasn't told me why he did it. He never explains himself. But he's been different since that evening. Less," she searched for the word, "absent. As though something called him back from wherever he's been retreating to since our father died." Elara absorbed this carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. It was 14 months ago, and I'm still learning to be sorry in the right proportions." Serafina's honesty was like a window opened unexpectedly, the fresh air slightly shocking after rooms full of managed air. He took on the title before he was ready. Caspian, I mean. He was already the kind of man who held himself responsible for everything, and then he was given everything to be responsible for, and there was no space left in him for anything else. She paused. "Until recently." The musicale resumed. A young woman at the pianoforte began a Scarlatti sonata with more enthusiasm than precision, and the room's conversation lowered to a polite murmur beneath it. Elara looked at her hands in her lap and thought about what to say that was both true and safe, and settled on the truth. "I'm not what anyone seems to think I am," she said quietly. "In either direction. I'm not the romantic discovery, and I'm not Lady Dorothea's charity case. I'm a scholar's daughter who cannot curtsy and doesn't know anyone in this city and has no particular plan for what comes next. I'm not a story." "Everyone is a story," Serafina said. "The only question is whether you're the one telling it." She said nothing more immediately, but when the musicale concluded and the room opened into conversation again, she did not leave Elara's side, and the particular gravity of being seen standing with the Duke's sister rearranged the room's attention in a way that was quieter than the bow, but somehow more lasting. She did not see the Duke himself for 11 days after the presentation. When she did, it was not at a ball or a dinner or any of the performances that made up the season's formal machinery. It was at a bookshop on King Street, Hatchetts, which she had been visiting every Thursday since her arrival in London because it was the one place in the city where she knew with absolute certainty what she was doing. She was reaching for a volume of Herodotus, the same edition her father had owned, when a hand reached past her shoulder and took it first. She turned. The Duke of Merrow stood behind her with her book in his hand and an expression that suggested he had not expected to find her there either, though whether this was true, she could not have said. "Herodotus," he said. "Not a question. My father's copy was lost in the sale of the house. I've been meaning to replace it." He looked at the book, then at her, with the same quality of attention she had observed at Ashbourne Hall, the kind that did not slide past its subject, but settled on it, complete. "Your father was a classicist?" "His primary love was Greek history. He had opinions about Thucydides that he would share at considerable length if given the opportunity." Something tightened briefly in her throat. He was the sort of man who believed that the ancient world contained every answer the modern one required, if you only read carefully enough. And did it? "I'm beginning to think the answers were always there. I'm simply less certain now that I know the right questions." The Duke was quiet for a moment. The bookshop moved around them, a clerk replacing volumes in the upper gallery, two women consulting in low voices near the window, and Elara was intensely aware that this was the first conversation they had actually had, the first time she had heard his voice directed at her, without the full weight of Ashbourne Hall listening to every syllable. He was different here, still precise, still contained, but the specific quality of his silence was different, less performed, less deliberate. It was the silence of a man who was thinking rather than managing. "Thucydides," he said at last, "believed that human nature was fixed, that the same catastrophes would recur because people were incapable of genuine change." He handed her the Herodotus. "My father disagreed. He thought Thucydides was confusing pattern with destiny." Elara took the book. Their fingers did not touch. It was remarkable, she thought, how aware she was of that fact. "What do you believe?" she asked. The Duke met her eyes. Something moved through his expression, not warmly precisely, but with the quality of a door not quite closing. "I am still deciding," he said. He purchased 2 volumes of his own. She did not see which ones and left without further ceremony. But at the door, he paused and turned back, and said, in a voice pitched for the two of them and the distance between them, "I hope you find what you are looking for, Miss Voss." She stood in the bookshop for quite some time after he was gone, holding the Herodotus with both hands, as though it might steady her. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a footman in Vane livery and addressed in a hand she did not recognize, small and quick and clearly that of someone who wrote often and well. Lady Serafina Vane requested the pleasure of Miss Voss's company at a small gathering at Merrow House the following Friday evening. A musicale, the note explained, though the informality of its tone suggested the musicale was more of an organizing premise than a genuine description. You would not be required to perform, Serafina had added at the bottom, in what was evidently a postscript of personal reassurance. I have heard about the curtsy, and I choose to believe the rest of your accomplishments are considerable. Her aunt read the invitation twice before setting it down with a controlled expression that could not quite contain its own significance. You will accept, she said. Elara had already decided. She wrote the acceptance herself. Merrow House was everything Ashbourne Hall was not in scale, which was considerable, but in feeling. Where Ashbourne Hall had been designed to impress, to overwhelm, to reduce its visitors to an appropriate sense of their own smallness before the grandeur of history, Merrow House felt like a place where someone had actually lived. The portraits in the entrance hall were balanced by bookshelves. The furniture in the receiving rooms showed evidence of actual use. Flowers on the mantelpiece had been arranged with affection rather than precision. Serafina met her at the door with the energy of someone for whom protocol was a polite fiction maintained for visitors who needed it. 12 guests, she had said in the invitation. There were 11, arranged in a drawing room that smelled of beeswax candles and the particular old paper warmth of books shelved nearby. Elara recognized 2 faces from Lady Sutton's musicale, one from a morning call her aunt had made last week, and none of them were Lady Dorothea, which felt like the first uncomplicated piece of good fortune in several weeks. The Duke was present. She had not allowed herself to expect him, and was therefore entirely unprepared for the moment she walked through the drawing-room door and found him already there, standing near the window with a glass he was not drinking, looking at her with an expression she could not read, but which had in it something that was not as Lady Dorothea would have her believe pity. He crossed the room to greet her, which was not. She understood from the slight shift in the other guest's attention, something he customarily did. Miss Voss. The formality was back, the public composure precise as always, but his eyes carried what the drawing-room could not see. I'm glad you came. Your sister's invitation was persuasive. My sister, he said, with the particular tone reserved for younger siblings who are entirely aware of what they are doing and doing it anyway, is rarely anything else. The evening unfolded with the easy warmth of a gathering organized by someone who genuinely liked people. Serafina's laughter threading through the conversations, her attention moving from guest to guest with the instinctive generosity of a natural host. Elara found herself actually talking, the way she had once talked in her father's study, with her full mind engaged rather than the portion she kept presentable for public consumption about history, about the nature of empire, about a translation question she'd been arguing with herself about for 3 weeks. And through all of it, she was aware of the Duke, moving through the room in his customary contained way, occasionally joining a conversation, occasionally listening from the periphery, always, in some configuration she couldn't quite map, within her field of awareness. It was near the end of the evening that it happened. Most of the guests had moved to the supper room, and Elara, in search of the particular quiet her father's ghost had always recommended after sustained social effort, had slipped through a half-open door into the library. She had not expected to find him already there. He stood at the far end of the room before a tall bookcase, his back to the door, a volume open in his hand. The candlelight fell across his shoulders and the edge of his profile, and in the silence of the library he was, she realized, genuinely alone in a way he had not been all evening. The composure not so much lowered as simply unnecessary, no audience requiring it. She should have withdrawn. She understood that clearly. The correct thing was to step back through the door, return to the supper room, and chalk the moment up to poor navigation. She did not withdraw. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't know anyone was here. He turned. Something crossed his features, not annoyance. The opposite of annoyance. Neither did I, until now. He held up the book briefly. My father's. She could see from the doorway that it was a volume of Greek verse. She moved further into the room, despite herself. He read Greek. He taught himself in his 30s. Said it was the only language that required enough concentration to make him stop thinking about everything else. The Duke closed the book, but did not replace it on the shelf. His hand remained on the cover with a care that was not about the book itself. He died before he became truly proficient. I've been finishing it for him. Elara crossed the room slowly and stopped a few feet away. The fire crackled in the grate. The distant sound of supper conversation filtered through the walls, comfortable and remote. I've been carrying my father's library key, she said, without quite deciding to. In my pocket, every day, since October. The house is gone and the books are gone and the key opens nothing anymore. But she stopped. But it was his, the Duke said. Yes. They stood in silence for a moment that had in it something entirely unlike the silences she had been navigating since her arrival in London. Not the silence of people performing disinterest at each other, not the silence of protocol or propriety. The silence of two people who recognized something in each other and were not yet certain what to do with that recognition. My grandmother, the Duke said eventually, has been reminding me with increasing frequency that grief is not a life. She isn't wrong. She is rarely wrong, which makes her considerably more difficult than she might otherwise be. A ghost of something crossed his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. She says I've been performing the title without inhabiting it, that there is a difference between bearing responsibility and actually being present for one's own existence. She sounds like a woman worth knowing. She is the most formidable person I have ever encountered, including every general and parliamentarian my position has required me to deal with, and she has made my life considerably more uncomfortable in the past several months by the simple act of being correct about everything. Elara looked at him, this man who commanded rooms by standing still in them, who had crossed a hall to bow to her without explanation, who was standing in his own library holding his dead father's book and speaking with the first unguarded honesty she had heard from him, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been very tightly held for a very long time. My father used to say, she offered, that the greatest error in classical history was the belief that strength and feeling were opposites, that Achilles was a better soldier for his grief, not despite it. She paused. I thought it was just a scholar's argument when I was young. I think now he was telling me something about himself, about how to be a person when the world requires you to be something else instead. The Duke was very still. Yes, he said, at last, in a voice that had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Something that cost him something. That is, yes. He looked at her for a long moment, and what passed between them in the firelit library was not a declaration and not a touch and not any of the things that the drawing rooms and the ballrooms and the season's entire elaborate machinery were designed to produce. It was something quieter and more serious than any of those things. It was two people recognizing, with the full clarity of minds that did not lie to themselves, that they were not strangers. It was Serafina who found them. She appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who has been looking for exactly this, and is far too tactful to say so. Supper is going rather well without you, she said, to neither of them in particular. Though Mrs. Aldgate Pembry has begun a story about her husband's hunting accident that I suspect will not improve. Elara stepped back. The space between her and the Duke reassembled itself into something appropriate. We should return, she said. Yes. But the Duke did not move immediately. He looked at her one more moment with that quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was not characteristic of him in general, but only in her specific presence, which was either a significant thing or the most dangerous misreading she had ever made in her life. Miss Voss. His voice was the formal register again, the composure intact. I find I have something to ask you. Not tonight, the circumstances are not right. But I would ask that you don't leave London before I have the opportunity. Elara's pulse steadied itself by an act of will. I have no plans to leave, Your Grace. Good. Something settled in his expression, a decision made, a direction chosen. Then we will continue this conversation at a more appropriate moment. He replaced the Greek verse on the shelf with deliberate care, inclined his head, and passed through the door. Serafina watched him go with an expression of barely contained delight. Well, she said. Don't, Elara replied. I wasn't going to say anything. You were thinking it very loudly. Serafina grinned and offered her arm. Come and rescue me from Mrs. Pembry's hunting story. You can tell me about Herodotus and I'll pretend I understand it, and we'll both be considerably happier. Elara took her arm, but as they walked back toward the candlelit warmth of the supper room, she was conscious of the library key pressing against her palm through the fabric of her dress, her father's key, opening nothing, still carried, and of the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain and terrifyingly possible. She did not know yet that by morning, everything would already be in motion to destroy it. The letter arrived before she had finished breakfast. It was addressed to her aunt, not to Elara herself, and it came from Lady Dorothea's household, a fact that was not stated but was legible in the quality of the paper and the particular shade of ink that Lady Dorothea's correspondents always used, as though she had a preferred color for precision. Her aunt read it at the table with a face that processed the information in visible stages, ending in an expression Elara could not immediately interpret. Helena, Elara said quietly. What does it say? Her aunt set the letter down with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something fragile. Lady Dorothea, she said, has been making inquiries into your father's estate. The room felt very still suddenly. What kind of inquiries? The kind that require a solicitor. Helena's voice was steady, but something beneath it was not. It appears that your father's debts were not, as we believed, entirely settled by the sale of the property. There is a remaining obligation, a small one, in the larger scheme, but sufficient to constitute an active debt. She paused. Associated, through your father's name, with yours. Elara absorbed this. How did Lady Dorothea obtain this information? She doesn't say, though she indicates, in language careful enough to be admired, that she intends to share it with the Duke's family solicitor as a matter of, she calls it, social responsibility, ensuring that those advising the Duke on matters of association are fully informed. The word association landed with its full weight. Elara stared at the tablecloth, at the pattern of the weave, regular and precise, something she could see clearly while the rest of the room blurred slightly at the edges. Lady Dorothea had not wasted time. She had assessed the situation with the efficiency of someone who had been managing threats to her position for years, identified the most effective point of pressure, not Elara's curtsy, not her borrowed gown, not the listing feathers, but her father's name and the debt that followed it, and applied force with surgical precision. The Duke's family would be informed. His grandmother, his advisors, the people whose opinions composed the infrastructure of his life, they would receive the information that Elara Voss, of Whitmore-on-Avon, came not merely from reduced circumstances, but from circumstances that carried specific, documentable liability. And they would advise him accordingly. She thought of the library, of his voice saying, "We will continue this conversation," of the quality of attention he had given her that was not kindness and not charity and not the performance of either. She thought about what it would mean to let him continue, to allow the conversation he had asked for to take place, while this piece of information moved through the channels that would reach him, not from her, not with context or explanation, but through the clean official language of legal obligation and social risk. She thought about the 23 other women in that presentation line, every one of whom had executed their curtsy correctly, every one of whom brought to the season the basic equipment that the season required. Fortune, or family, or the absence of liabilities that a woman in her position could not pretend away. "I see," she said. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought about her father's key. "I think," she said carefully, to the tablecloth, "that I need some air." She walked to the small rear garden and stood in the thin morning light with her hands clasped together and the key pressing against her fingers through the fabric of her dress. And she thought about the Duke of Merrow standing in his library, saying, "I am still deciding." And she thought, "So am I." But deciding required honesty. And honesty required that she acknowledge what she had been trying not to acknowledge since the evening in the library, which was this: that she had been falling, with the quiet thoroughness of someone who does things completely when they do them at all, and that the ground was very far down, and that the letter now sitting on her aunt's breakfast table was not the wall that would stop the fall. It was simply the moment she realized how far it already was. She did not cry. She stood in the garden in the thin light until she was steady again, and then she went inside and wrote a letter to Seraphina Vane declining the next invitation, with regrets, citing a prior engagement that did not exist. She told herself it was the practical thing. She told herself that a woman who understood the rules of the world she lived in would recognize when the moment for something had passed, and accept it with the grace that circumstance required, and return to the business of surviving. She told herself these things clearly and precisely, in the same voice she used for all her most necessary self-deceptions. And in her pocket, her father's key pressed against her palm, cold and specific, the exact weight of something that opened nothing anymore. He came on a Wednesday, not through her aunt's formal channels, not with a calling card submitted to the drawing room and a polite wait on the appropriate chair. He came to the rear garden door, the one that opened onto the narrow lane behind the Westfield townhouse, and knocked with the particular deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of what is on the other side. Elara was the one who opened it, because the housekeeper was busy and her aunt was out, and she was not expecting anyone, which was precisely why she was in the garden in the first place, standing in the thin afternoon light with her father's key in her open palm, doing the thing she had been doing more often lately, which was looking at it, and trying to determine when she intended to stop carrying it. She opened the door. The Duke of Merrow stood in the lane with no carriage and no footman, and the expression of a man who has had the specific conversation with himself that strips away every rehearsed version of what one intends to say. "You declined Serafina's invitation," he said. "I had a prior engagement." "You did not." She looked at him steadily. "No. I know about the letter." He did not move from the doorway. "Lady Dorothea's letter to your aunt. I know what it contained. I know about your father's debt." A pause. "I knew before the letter. My solicitor reviews such things routinely when I ask him to make inquiries." Something lurched in her chest. "You had inquiries made? After the bookshop?" "Yes." His jaw was tight. "I knew about the debt. I knew about the sale of the estate, the library, the leaking roof. I knew all of it, and I asked you not to leave London anyway, because none of it changed anything that matters." The lane was very quiet. Somewhere at the far end of it a cart moved past, and then the quiet returned, absolute as held breath. "It changes what I can bring to this," Elara said, because honesty was the only thing she had ever been consistent at. "It changes what I am, in the language your world uses to measure people." "My world's language," he said, "has been measuring me for 14 months by the precise distance between who I am and who my father was, and finding me insufficient on every count. I am not interested in applying that same measurement to you." He stepped across the threshold into the garden without being invited, which she understood was intentional, a deliberate closing of the last formal distance between them, the one that had been maintained by doorways and drawing rooms, and the entire elaborate architecture of a social world designed to keep people like them from ever simply speaking to each other. "My grandmother," he said, and something in his voice shifted, became less controlled and more present, "read Lady Dorothea's letter before I did. She came to my study afterward and placed it on my desk and said, 'The Pembry girl is trying to frighten you away from someone worth keeping. I would advise against being frightened.'" A ghost of warmth crossed his features. "She has never in my recollection described anyone as worth keeping." Elara felt something that had been wound very tightly begin, with great caution, to loosen. "She hasn't met me. She intends to remedy that." She used the phrase, "without delay," which in her vocabulary constitutes urgency. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see what was underneath the composure now, the thing she had glimpsed in the library, no longer glimpsed but present, plain and undefended. Elara. Her name. Not Miss Voss. Not the formal register that kept the distance safe. "I have been absent," he said. "My sister's word. My grandmother's word. My own word, when I am honest enough to use it. I have been performing the life I inherited and calling it living, and I was prepared to do so indefinitely, because I could not see what I was missing." His voice was low and certain and entirely without rehearsal. "I looked across a room and saw a woman trying to disappear into a marble pillar, and something in me that had been very still for a very long time refused to remain still any longer." He paused. "I have not been the same since. I find I do not want to be." She looked at her father's key, still in her palm. Then she looked up at him. "I carry this," she said, "because he is gone and everything he built is gone and it opens nothing anymore, and I have not been able to put it down." Her voice was steady, steadier than she expected. "I think I have been holding it because I did not know yet what I was supposed to reach for instead." He looked at the key, then at her face. Then, slowly, deliberately, the same quality of intention he had brought to the bow at Ashbourne Hall, he offered her his hand. Not to take the key, not to replace it. Simply his hand, open, available, leaving the choice entirely to her. She placed her palm in his. Lady Dorothea's letter achieved nothing except the illumination of its own purpose. The Duke's grandmother, who had spent 50 years making London society's opinions and could therefore dismantle them with equal efficiency, had precisely 3 conversations in precisely 3 drawing rooms, and the interpretation of events restructured itself accordingly. What had been whispered as charity became what it had always been, a man of conviction seeing clearly in a room full of performance and acting on it. Lady Dorothea left for the country in the 3rd week of June. No one marked her absence with anything but relief. The morning Elara Voss became the Duchess of Merrow, Serafina placed a single volume of Herodotus on the breakfast table beside her plate with a card that read, "For the new library, which will need considerably more than this. A beginning, at least. The Duke's grandmother received her in the formal sitting room before the ceremony with the compressed efficiency of a woman who has decided and will not revisit the decision. "You will make mistakes," she said. "This world is not one you were trained for." "No," Elara agreed. "You will learn. You are clearly capable of learning, which is more than can be said for most people given every advantage you are not." A pause, precise and considered. "My grandson has not looked like himself in 14 months. Since the evening of the presentation, he has." She straightened a cuff with absolute composure. "I do not typically approve of things I did not arrange. In this case, I am choosing to make an exception." She offered her hand. Elara took it. That evening, in the library at Merrow House, her library now, the thought still strange, and sure in equal measure, Elara placed her father's key on the shelf beside the Herodotus. Not put away, not forgotten, simply set down, in a room full of books and firelight and the quiet certainty of a life that was, at last, entirely hers to inhabit. The Duke found her there, as he had a way of doing. "Still deciding?" she asked. He crossed the room and stood beside her and looked at the key on the shelf with the expression of a man who understands exactly what he is looking at. "No," he said, "not anymore." He took her hand, the same gesture, the same intention, always the same quality of certainty, and outside the library windows, London continued its vast, indifferent turning, full of drawing rooms and calling cards and the elaborate machinery of a world that measured people in the language of fortune and position and family name. And inside, in the firelight, two people who had found each other by accident and stayed by choice stood in the quiet together and called it, without apology, enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than that. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.